Welcome back, everyone, to All Things Hidden podcast. It's great to have you with us. I've got a very interesting topic, something that is, I think, kind of hidden, and I think we all need to know. Before we get started, just a reminder that this podcast is for entertainment purposes only. I would love at the end if you can. You'll probably need the meditation today after this discussion. So I just really encourage you, if you will, to sit and ground with us and really drop in and start to get connected with your own internal truth, because it requires that as we head on the journey. Today, I am fortunate to have a beautiful woman named Jessica Barsotti in the house with us today. She is a Bay Area local attorney, lawyer. She has been a native to this area of San Francisco going back to the late 1800s. Her family was in the music business and well known in that industry. Through her law firm, Jessica has represented clients in civil rights, constitutional rights, housing rights, police misconduct, real estate, business, insurance litigation, including litigation involving faith organizations. Jessica is a highly successful litigator and trial attorney, and she has been lead counsel in 13 jury trials and multiple bench trials, vindicating her clients' rights again and again. So for the last, what I'd love to go into is what she's most recently been doing, and she has helped achieve a high jury award in California for religious discrimination in the workplace related to the COVID vaccine employment mandates in California in Chavez versus Bart through her trial expertise working with the lead attorneys in that case. Jessica is not only just an interesting person, but she has got a lot of experience here. And we're going to be looking directly at the IRS, the Internal Revenue Service. And we're going to be doing a deep dive into its origin and where it came from, why it exists, the implications it has on all of us. But before we go there, I want to touch base with her. One of the ways I came to know Jessica was she was working in Children's Health Defense Fund here in California. And I'd love her to start maybe there and share a little bit about her experience there. And then we'll look at possibly this case that she just resolved here in the Bay Area. And from there, we'll head into more things IRS. So welcome, Jessica. Thank you for being here.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, Christa. I've been an attorney for 25 years. I've been here in the Bay Area for all that time. Back in 2020, I joined forces with Children's Health Defense California, which is Bobby Kennedy's organization. He has a national organization that's called Children's Health Defense, but they had a satellite corporation, nonprofit here in California that they started in 2020. And so I became involved in that organization as a volunteer initially because I was concerned about what I saw going around with our rights seemingly being taken away and things really going sideways, what it looked like to me.
Rights regarding what with the Children's Defense?
Well, in 2020, of course, with COVID, they had the lockdowns. Kids couldn't go to school. Then we had the masking mandates. There were extended local emergencies, which a lot of people don't realize put huge amounts of power in the local government. Basically, when you're under a local emergency, you have no rights. Essentially.
Okay.
All of your rights are taken away because there's a quote unquote emergency. The government has to quote unquote do what they have to do to fix everything, make everybody safe, etc. And so under those circumstances, you don't have a lot of rights, personal rights. When there's a state of emergency, for example, they could come and take your stuff and say, we need this for the emergency. They could come into your home. They can do a lot of things that they normally wouldn't be able to do, including telling you that you're locked down, telling you can't go to school, which normally you would have freedom of movement, right?
So with the Child's Defense Fund, what were you up to with them at this time? Was this related? I know that they support the vaccine schedule and children, and there's a history there that they're looking at that correlation between vaccines and possibly autism. This has been a big discussion in the world for quite a while. And did you have any relation to that at all, or?
No. So yes, Children's Health Defense, Bobby Kennedy, as I understand it, he created that organization because he was concerned about children's health. And he had spent a long time getting mercury out of rivers, and mercury in fish cause a lot of problems, cognitive problems and things like that for children. That's where he realized there's a problem here, and he wanted to see what he could do. And, he got kind of dragged into the vaccine arena.
So environmental into, yeah.
Right, because there was also mercury supposedly in the vaccines. And so there was kind of a correlation there. And then he started looking into that. Of course, it's very controversial, the claims about vaccine and autism and all of that. So I'm not here to speak on that, and I didn't litigate on those issues.
Thank you.
What I did was really take the government to task for following the rules. So as a lawyer, one of the things that you can do is, if there's a problem, you look to the rules. What are the rules, and what are people supposed to be doing, and what are they not doing? And basically what happened when I joined Children's Health Defense California, we were looking at, like I just mentioned, there were boards of supervisors who kept a state of emergency going. And I don't want to go into the details because it'll probably bore everybody, but essentially there are time periods when you're supposed to be checking on these emergencies and either getting rid of them or continuing them. And they weren't doing that. And they had a bunch of excuses about why they weren't doing it, but the bottom line is that they weren't following the rules that were actually made for emergencies. So, all these excuses of like, oh, this is a totally unprecedented pandemic, it didn't matter because the rules we were talking about were rules specifically for emergencies. So
thank you. Well, one, we want to say thank you for being on top of that, because that is a really unprecedented time frame that we were in, and a lot of us didn't know. And so thank you for knowing and working on our behalf. I love that. I want to shift over. Enough said with this. Thank you. You're doing lots of other things now, but I want to shift over to what was, from what I understand, an incredible recent case that I mentioned briefly in my introduction to you, that it sounds like you came in on the 11th hour. This case was well underway, and you implemented something they just weren't thinking about. And that's clearly the vision that you have as a lawyer, as an attorney, as having experience being in front of juries and knowing what you're up against. Could you speak a little bit to that case and what went down? And that would be really, I think, enlightening for a lot of people.
Yeah, so this case was a case, a lot of people remember back in 2021, 2022, there were a lot of people that were facing employment mandates for the COVID vaccine. And there were also a lot of people who had objections to taking the COVID vaccine based on their religion. And many companies did not take the religious objections very seriously. And, they kind of went through the motions.
By law, are they required to?
Yes.
Okay.
They're required to, under Title VII of federal law, you can't discriminate against people in the workplace for their religious beliefs. And so when it came to the COVID vaccine, the question became, people who had an objection to it, could they be accommodated in the workplace? Basically, accommodated means, can they still have their job and not take the vaccine, right? So, of course, everybody was worried about health and safety, and they were saying it wasn't safe to be in the workplace if you were unvaccinated. But people took it, I think, too far. And there's a federal group called OSHA, which, deals with occupational safety. And OSHA, even at that time, had given out regulations, and they recommended vaccination. But they also said, well, if you're not vaccinated, then you can test weekly, do the other measures, masking and distancing, and that would be okay. In the case with BART, they weren't willing to allow these employees to take those other measures. And they basically took a very hard line that if you're unvaccinated, you're unsafe in the workplace. That's it. And so they fired a lot of people. And
so how many people did they fire, and how many plaintiffs were there in this case?
I don't know how many total people they fired. I believe it was over 200, but I'm not certain about that.
Okay.
In this case, there were 6 plaintiffs.
6.
There
Okay.
had been, I believe, over 100 plaintiffs to begin with. They had all settled along the way. 6 plaintiffs ended up at trial in San Francisco federal court. A lot of people said they were very nervous because they didn't feel like San Francisco was maybe the best venue for this kind of a case. And they did go to trial, and they had a hung jury in the first trial. And it was in federal cases, you have 8 jurors. So it was 7 against them and 1 holdout. And
Wow,
so
interesting.
it was, and basically the 1 holdout said, well, I think that BART could have accommodated these people. I don't see why they couldn't. And the rest of the jurors said, no, actually, they did the right thing.
Interesting. So you came in, okay, this is like, they brought you in late, right?
Yes.
You were coming right in before. And what did you supplied something, I remember the story from months ago. It was pretty ingenious that they hadn't really looked at this angle, it sounds like.
Well, the first trial, I came in as a trial expert. And so when I looked at the first trial, I thought, maybe this jury isn't going to really like this angle. And so I wanted to reframe the way that we explained what happened in this case. And so the second trial, we didn't have an expert witness because I felt like it wasn't about the science. It's, and the trial team agreed. And so we all kind of agreed that we'd take a different approach and not talk about the science, but really talk about, these people all took COVID seriously. They had very serious religious objections to it, and they would do other measures that would make sure that everybody stayed safe. The same thing that they had been doing the whole time before that.
And many other corporations were already doing.
Right. And so basically we argued to the jury, why wasn't that enough? It had been enough all the way up until, most of these people got fired in 2022. So we're talking all of 2021, there were no mandates. They didn't have it. And then all of a sudden, it's a huge problem. And it doesn't make sense because nothing changed.
Exactly.
So that's basically what we talked about in the second trial. And we ended up getting a unanimous verdict in our favor.
Wow, a unanimous.
Yes.
That's amazing. That's
Yeah.
amazing. So is this case over, or is it got any
BART
other...
has now appealed.
BART has appealed?
Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
got it. What was the payout? Just curious, because it might have been...
It was $7.8 million for the 6 plaintiffs.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. Well, are you involved in the case going forward with the appeal?
I am not involved in the appeal.
Okay.
Pacific Justice Institute was the firm that brought this case to trial. They did an excellent job. I got brought in at the last minute, like we just talked about, and they are handling the appeal right now.
Okay.
So,
Well, kudos for you. I mean, it sounds like you brought it down the home stretch. They're just as the system goes, we know the system, appeals will happen. Yeah. It just does. And
Right.
they don't want to pay out.
right. So we're pretty confident that they're not going to be able to overturn this jury's verdict. They attempted in some motions, post-trial motions, to throw the verdict out, and the judge said no. So this is another bite at the apple. They're going to do what they can to try to.
Well, you're insightful in the sense that you're not just all law, you're not all science. You have a heart as well. And so I hope they'll continue to use you in counsel on some level if they can, because I think you'd probably be a real attribute to this case going forward.
Yeah, I mean, they're great. Everybody there, I really love all the attorneys over there. They're really excellent attorneys that really care about their clients.
Undoubtedly.
So,
Okay,
yeah.
I want to turn it over and go into the subject matter for today. It's, you sent me some notes, and you've done a lot of extensive research in this department, and I know you're going to note some of your sources and what have you, because this isn't something you made up out of thin air. It's just actually, this research really exists, these stats really exist, these facts really exist, and it's an interesting subject matter right now, because politically, in our current political arena, this is on the table as possibly being, going away, the Internal Revenue Service. Like, okay, so, looking at, what is it, where did it begin? Why was it implemented in the first place? I want to hope to look at all of that, and then to really look at research that you've come up with that from the lawful and legal, and I think there's a difference between those. There's legal and lawful. We're going to discuss what's going on right now. Like, what do we, the people, need to know? Because these are our tax dollars. This is our money that we really work hard for. And as we know with the USAID right now, a lot of money has been misappropriated and given to organizations that maybe are not serving us, but rather more personal interests. So this is just a hot topic. Thank you for being here. Not an easy topic because but there's real facts here. So with that, I would love to kind of dive in here. I want to read a question that this is your primary question. This is yours. I'm going to read it to you. Is the IRS a lawful organization within the U.S. Department of Treasury, or does it function as a private collection agency outside the scope of constitutional law? ? And if it operates outside law, does it have any authority to collect taxes from people living in the United States? I'm going to hand it over to you and just let you go.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. I feel like this is really timely, this discussion, because as you mentioned, Trump is talking about dismantling the IRS and various things. And then there's also this other discussion about DOJ, right? And is DOJ a legitimate, agency or office or whatever you want to call it? Can they be doing the things they're doing? Is this proper? Et cetera. And a lot of people point to the fact that, well, there's no act of Congress that created DOJ. Why is DOJ able to do anything? And interestingly, if you look into the IRS, you might make those same arguments about the IRS. And a lot of people don't talk about that, but obviously everyone knows that the IRS is a government agency, supposedly, that is responsible for collecting taxes. And I'm sure many people have heard many people over the years, anecdotally at least, saying that I don't have to pay taxes, we're not required to pay taxes, I'm not paying taxes. And of course, you probably also heard people have been thrown in jail for that. And so I always thought, I don't know if there's any validity to this claim that we don't have to pay taxes and we don't owe taxes, and taxes are BS, basically.
People simply don't want to pay them, period, whether it's real or not.
Right. And so I always figured, people just are making stuff up. They
Totally.
don't, they just don't want to do it. But over the past 5 years, and I've been exposed even before that to corruption and fraud in pretty much every facet of life that I've looked into deeply, including the government, and maybe especially the government. And so I thought, well, I wonder if there's anything to this. And so I started to look into it myself. And I thought, well, is it true?
I just want to appreciate you because you're coming from a legal perspective. You're an attorney, and you're looking at this directly. And I would argue that a lot of attorneys won't look at this. Well, it could be controversial.
Well, yes. And that's the problem that I've found. I mean, I'm a bit of a rogue attorney, so I'm not the one that follows all the rules. I follow the rules, but, I don't. A lot of attorneys have a very hard time looking into things that they weren't taught about and looking into things that maybe kind of diverge from the things that you were taught in law school. Mm-hmm. And you see that same trend among people like doctors, right? Doctors are like, that's not what I was taught in medical school. Well, sometimes you weren't taught everything. And so same thing with law school, is that everything we learned in law school maybe wasn't the whole story. And so I've actually taken it upon myself over the last several years to look into things. I mean, the IRS isn't the only thing I've looked into, but it's one of them. And there are many things. Another example is, operating in the private. That's something that a lot of lawyers don't like to look at. There's a lot of legal, precedent for that, but it's something that's not common, and so lawyers don't typically know a lot about it.
So let's go before we dive into how it's affecting us today and some truth facts. We should look at where did it begin? It's called the Federal Reserve. Internal Federal Reserve.
Well, you're conflating two things. So there's the Internal Revenue Service, right? And then there's the Federal Reserve System, right?
Thank you.
Those are two separate things. And actually, a lot of people don't know they were created, I believe, simultaneously back in 1913.
Yes, they were.
And they support each other because the Federal Reserve, prints our money for us and charges us interest on $1, and then the IRS is making sure that loan is what they call, it's kind of interesting that they print our money and it's called a loan, but that's the way it's set up. And so the loan,
their notes
are now, it's collateralized, right, by people. So the IRS is the organization that they're going to make sure that they get their collateral, they get their money back, right?
Exactly.
So that's sort of how it's set up, yeah.
Okay, I'm going to go back a little further. So, in my research, and I looked at this years ago, I have a little personal history with this. I am a daughter of the Revolution, and I'll tell you why, because it's very interesting. My great aunt, going back numerous generations, her name was Elizabeth Leatherhead, and she came over here on one of the original Mayflowers.
Leatherhead, is that like her real name?
Her real name, Leatherhead.
Wow,
yep.
Okay.
And she ended up marrying Samuel Cutter, which is my mom's maiden name, Cutter. And she basically, what happened was when my mom's brother was really, really sick, for 3 years, she nursed him through cancer. His wife brought in a real genealogist, not like an ancestry or a whatever, but a real genealogy team that came and sat at her dining room table day after day for like 6 months. And they went back and they created a book that's about 3 inches thick to my mom's background.
Oh,
and what's fascinating is I'm like a direct descendant to Roger Sherman. Do you know who Roger Sherman is?
No.
Okay, so Roger Sherman is one of the founding fathers of our Constitution. He signed all 4 documents. He signed,
okay.
No one else signed all 4 of them, which is the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, the Articles of Confederation, and then there's one other one. So I have this we were talking about quantum in the last interview. I have this feeling towards our forefathers, because he's directly in my lineage. So it got me researching a lot of this as to where this whole idea of taxation came from. And what's really interesting is, we go back into the late 1800s when the slaves were actually freed, yes? However, they weren't really freed in the sense they were now able to make money, but they were then put into a system for a taxation on their labor. So that was the beginning of the idea of taxation. Now, that was in the late 1800s.
Right. Yeah, you're right. That was the very first income tax came right after the Civil War.
Exactly.
But it only lasted 3 years because nobody was happy with it, and they got rid of it.
They did get rid of it?
Yes.
Okay.
And then it came back in 1913.
Well, see, I think it came back sooner than that because what I understood that, maybe I don't understand this correctly, but what I researched is that they saw that they didn't need to just get it from them. They could get it from all of us. That they could now put us in what is the Social Security number, which was established actually the year my mom was born, 1934. And basically, we were on to their template now. We were not going to be what would be a citizen. We are now a corporate entity under a number, Social Security number, that was now able to tax us and all of our earnings. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, you're kind of getting ahead of us, but yeah, that did happen later. I mean, initially, the IRS was created. There were a bunch of court cases that struck it down. Not the IRS, but the whole income tax structure. Mm-hmm. And then they kind of reconfigured it, and it came back. And so, yeah, a lot of this stuff happened in the history, but the taxation system when it comes to the Social Security numbers and the Social Security Act of 1933, that's 20 years after what I'm talking about here today.
Totally. Yeah. Let me go back to, because I'm going to read something out of a source book here. It's called You Know Something Is Wrong When. This is by a woman named Anna Marie Reitzinger and James Clinton Belcher. And they wrote in circa 1912 A group of mostly European banking interests plus some turncoat American bankers formed a private association and called it the Federal Reserve, so that people would naturally assume it was part of the federal government. They combined resources to purchase a middleman spot for themselves between the Congress and the intended victims, all United States corporations. So, as you said, they worked in tandem, the Federal Reserve and the IRS. This came about as, I talked about Lysander Spooner, who had a quote, "Any number of scoundrels having enough money to start with can establish themselves as a government, because with the money they can hire soldiers, with the soldiers extort more money, and also compel general obedience to their will." The reason I kind of brought that forth is that there was a lot going on back then, that I don't think we know today that affects the IRS and what we're dealing with today. So I'm going to hand it over to you to speak to all that.
Yeah, I mean, it's very convoluted and confusing what has happened here, and I think that's by design. But, it started, well, I want to go back to the beginning.
Perfect.
And so let me talk about how I got into this. There's a person named Joe Bannister who was a former special agent for the IRS, Criminal Investigation Division. So he was the guy that went out and busted people, right, for not paying taxes. And he started studying all of this stuff. And he ended up publishing a book, an expose, really, that in, I believe it was 1999, that showed that the IRS is deceiving everybody, and the way that this whole thing is done is actually fraudulent. And of course, he was absolutely attacked and destroyed, and of course, he was no longer at the IRS. But he's still around, and he still has a website that's called agentfortruth.com. And he was the person that I saw an interview of several years ago that I was like, hold on a second. This guy sounds like he knows what he's talking about. And so I went and looked at his website, which has a lot of information. And so he laid out this whole explanation, some of which I was not able to verify, but a lot of which I was. And so I just found it very fascinating. And on there, he actually talks about how he got introduced to this information from another woman who I believe also worked as an IRS investigator, and her name was Devi Kidd. And Devi Kidd came out even before him, in the early 90s, I want to say, and talked about all this stuff. And she was the one who kind of turned him on to what's going on, and then he started looking into it. And Devi Kidd is also still around, and she has a website that's Devi.com. It's DEVVY.com. So if anybody wants to look into these things further, these are great resources for this information.
Great.
And then there's another person I want to mention. His name is Paymon, and I don't know his last name. I think he's like Cher or something. Goes by one name. But anyways, Paymon, he also has a website called freedomlawschool.com. And there he actually trains people to understand this stuff really well. I think you can pay for a course or something like that with him. And he also has a group you can join of I guess, non-taxpayers. And I believe, if I'm not mistaken, he said that there's 80 million people that don't pay taxes in America, which I thought was high. I was surprised about that. And I haven't verified that, but that's what he said.
80 million that don't pay.
Correct.
Okay.
And on his website, he says that the best way to get yourself put in jail for not paying taxes is to file a tax return. Because, and it's true when you look at the forms, and you'll see when I go through this material that you may not be required to pay taxes. But once you fill out the 1040 IRS form, you're saying under penalty of perjury, I owe taxes. So it becomes a whole thing that you get roped into something that perhaps you're not even...
I learned the word federal means contract law or contract government. That's what federal means. So all these things we get, when we give a signature, we go under contract.
Well, right. And I mean, and it's not even, it says right there, I declare under penalty of perjury, this is all true and I owe taxes. Here's my signature. So you bring yourself into the system by filing
Got
right?
it. Okay.
Now, the question is, well, there's two questions. Is the IRS a proper agency? Is it an agency of the Department of Treasury? And can they collect taxes from us? Right? Those
Yeah.
are really the two questions. And
Well, I heard it's voluntary.
well, initially it was voluntary, but then the 16th Amendment, which has its own issues, supposedly made it, not voluntary and required. And then, of course, they put into law the tax code. So now that's law. But we have to go all the way back to the beginning, because where does the Internal Revenue Service, they call it a bureau, right? So it's referred to as a bureau of the U.S. Department of Treasury. That's how they always talk about it. But it's not legally classified like that. So, like, if you look at the definition of bureau, if you look at Black's Law Dictionary, it's a name given to the several departments of the executive or administrative branch of the government, right? So once you say bureau, you're automatically saying it's part of the government.
Interesting. Okay.
But when you look into the history, and a lot of people say the problem with the IRS is that it wasn't created by an organic act of Congress, right? Because if I'm going to create the Department of Health, and then the Congress says, okay, we're creating the Department of Health, and this is what it's going to be, et cetera, et cetera. That never happened in the case of the IRS.
So Congress wasn't involved. It was an organic act.
No. Congress did create the commissioner, an Internal Revenue Commissioner person.
And what is their role?
And their job was to collect tariffs and taxes, right? Because the U.S. always had the ability to levy taxes. That's never been a question. The question is, who are you taxing and for what, right? So you could always levy tariffs on imports or whatever. You could always do that. You could also levy taxes on, and this is where it starts getting weird, because the definition of income becomes very squirrely, right? Because initially, income meant, and there's a bunch of Supreme Court cases that we can put, that we can show the viewers, that talk about the definition of income. And repeatedly, and we're talking 10 cases or more, agreed that the definition of income was it's gains from capital, right? And that's very different than gains from your work.
From labor, yeah.
Right. So capital is like, let's say you have a machine that creates donuts, and now you're making donuts every day, and you sell the donuts, and now you're getting money from selling these donuts. That's gains from capital, right? But it's not the same if you're cleaning a house. That's not gains from capital, right?
Exactly.
That's gains from your work. And so there became this whole discussion of what is income? And because they start messing with the language, right? And this is how these things happen: it says one thing but it means another, or it says one thing, you think it means that, but it actually means something different, and then nobody really knows what's going on.
They love us confused.
Yeah, exactly. So let's start with the creation of the IRS, because we have this commissioner that was created as an organic act of Congress. They created an Internal Revenue Commissioner. This person can go collect.
Can you give us a time frame of this? Is this early 1900s? When is this?
I don't remember when that happened.
Okay.
But it was before all of this. So
Okay.
it would have been late 1800s, early 1900s, something like that.
Fair enough.
So the commissioner somehow became the bureau. And how that happened is a little bit confusing.
But he's one individual.
Right.
Okay.
And now it's like thousands of employees, right? So it went from one person to the bureau, the service that now has thousands of employees and hundreds of offices throughout the United States, right? So how did that happen? And that's what's actually very confusing. And there's a very good book called The Fruit of the Poisonous Tree.
I've heard of this. Yeah.
That goes through this in detail. And I would highly recommend that. It's very convoluted. It's very confusing. And I think the point here is
Yeah, what's the takeaway?
It went from a person to a bureau.
To a bureau.
And
Creating
how that happened.
Bureaucracy.
Right. And how that happened was not through any act of Congress. It was through all these little acts of other people doing things that likely were outside of their authority. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean?
Got it.
So
they're like a collection agency.
Yes.
Yeah.
Correct.
Basically. Just
correct.
Like, yeah.
So
did they establish a difference between this tax on sales and the corporation getting their taxation versus the labor?
Yes, and that's, I mean, I read a lot of these cases, and like if you read any of these cases, your head would probably explode because it's so confusing the way that they explain it.
If it's confusing to you, I would have been asleep by the second paragraph.
Yeah,
So.
and I mean, I have a list here of about 10 Supreme Court cases on this issue of what is income and how you figure it out and whether it's proper, and it's exceedingly confusing.
Yes.
And also they're all old cases from like, the late 1800s, early 1900s. So the language is really antiquated also.
Right.
So it makes it super hard to get through. But the bottom line is that, as I said, there was like this question of does it have to come from capital? And then they started using other language. I forget exactly. It's like increase in wealth or something like that was very nebulous. And so basically what happened was for a long time they defined it a certain way, coming from the capital, right, the income. And then one case they said, well, it could kind of like come from capital or work. And there they started they just latched onto that and just ran with it as far as they could.
Wow. And then hit on everyone.
Right.
Anyone going out and putting $1 in the bank.
That's right. So going back to the creation of the IRS, just to kind of show people where this question is coming from. So we have the commissioner that was created by an organic act of Congress. But then when you look at, like, there's the Federal Register and there's also the Internal Revenue Manuals, and they talk about, they say, this is all legitimate, and they try to say everything's great. But then when you actually look at the language, all they say is we created a commissioner. And they're like, look, here, the Federal Register. This shows that we have all this authority. And all the Federal Register says is, yeah, we created a commissioner. That doesn't prove anything, right?
Right.
So, like, for example, 36 FR 849 to 890, that's in the Federal Register. You can see they point to that as their authority. But if you read through that whole thing, which is incredibly annoying, it's not there. It's not there. It says they created a commissioner. That's it.
Wow. Okay. And so we're just, as people, to accept that, and then accept the bureau that they bring on after that, and then, and what time frame is this still in the like 30s that we're all of a sudden starting, all of us, under labor and under contract and sales?
Well, it started with the Revenue Act of 1913.
Okay.
And that's where they started to say that they could tax everybody on their income from any source, is what it said.
Okay.
So now they're trying to expand the definition, right?
Got it.
But that was attacked in a lot of Supreme Court cases, the Internal Revenue Act of 1913, and they ended up amending it. And that is also very nebulous about it's interesting if you go to Wikipedia, they're like, oh yeah, these Supreme Court cases totally agreed with the taxation. But if you read the cases, it's not that cut and dry. So you see this kind of massaging of the truth in all these various sources, right?
And they're linking us into the government through the commissioner. Otherwise,
that's correct.
This is a separate entity that's really not governmental at all. That's
right. So basically, somehow the appointment of a commissioner of Internal Revenue was then transformed into the Bureau of Internal Revenue. And like I said, the book, The Fruit of the Poisonous Tree, is by Mel Stamper. And you can get it on Amazon. And that explains all this. I have to say it's kind of poorly written in my opinion, but it has a lot of good information in there. So you got to really dig in.
For those who want to do their research.
Yeah, it's a great book to look at. So what other proof do we have that this changing from the commissioner into the bureau was not proper? Well, there's statutes and codes too, right? So you have, like, for example, the Department of Treasury is codified in the United States codes in 31 U.S. code, and then you have sections.
So explain codified real quick. So
Yeah,
in case a
so
listener-
so you have laws that are created, and this is a whole longer discussion, but there are private laws and there are public laws, and there were law sheets, and they all kind of got combined into a treatise that they called the United States Code. And so now they've got a written version of every law. And once they created those books, that's what they call codify the laws.
Yeah, it's so funny because when our founding fathers created this country, we had about, I don't know, I'm going to exaggerate this number, but like 100 laws and statutes and rules. And now we have hundreds of thousands.
That's correct.
Hundreds of thousands that were all made up along the way to, I think, serve not the people, but other interests. Now, I'm not going to say what those interests are, but it's kind of interesting where we've come, under like what was originally our rights. And now we're up against so much bureaucracy with so many statutes, so many regulations, they're all made up to serve, I think, as I said a minute ago, other interests, not ours, the people.
Well, it's very interesting when you look at, the 14th Amendment. I'll come back and talk about that because that's a whole other discussion. But in there, the 14th Amendment brought us due process of law and made everybody citizens. Right. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery. The 14th Amendment made everybody a citizen.
Yep.
But the problem with that is that at the same time they turned the country into a corporation. So now we're citizens of the corporation rather than members of the republic. And so it changed the whole legal status. But anyways, that's a whole other discussion.
Yeah. Well, it's a big one though because it plays into this and it's an interesting. Right now, if you're listening to the political terrain, there's talk about us returning to a republic, that the democracy that we've been under, although it has an interesting outlay, if you go back to Greece and freedom and, different things. However, it's gotten kind of twisted over the many years. And we're now, I think, starving to return to a republic under a constitution with a lot less laws, a lot less statutes, a lot less... And to really work with organizations that are in fact lawful, and they're in fact, if they are part of our government, that's well established. Right now, what I think we're looking at is an IRS and a Federal Reserve that were connected to a corporation, and it begs the question: are we still under that corporation, or should we be under a corporation at all? Which is a big question because, like, a president leads a corporation. When we built this Constitution for a republic, I mean, we were basically creating colonies and leaders in each one of the colonies, and they represented the people. And that was the most important thing. So it goes to that fact that it used to be like the hierarchy of God. Under God was the people, all of us. Under us was the government. The government adhered to what we thought, and under that was the corporations. And in this flip, in 1913, it went boom. Corporations at the top. The government adheres to the corporation. We, the people, have to adhere to both of them. And where is God in the mix?
Yeah, God got left out. And you're right that the corporate structure has completely flipped everything on its head. And I think that we're still... I'm just figuring out how this whole thing happened, and I think most people are in that boat of like, what happened? How did we get here? And are we stock certificates in the corporation? I don't know.
Right. But we're, our hard-earned money, and it's getting worse and worse because it's getting more and more. I mean, we're actually not bad compared to like France. I think in France, 60% of their income goes to taxes. Like here, we're not there, thank God. But we're still putting out a lot. And
we don't get a lot for it.
We don't.
Because that's the thing. I mean, Europe has it's very much more socialistic over there. And so, yes, you pay very high taxes, but you get a lot for it. Like, for example, my son is in school in Europe right now. It's practically free for university.
Right.
You know?
There's the difference. Yeah.
Also, all your health care, 100% free. You're not paying for anything. So, yeah. I don't know what's better. I personally prefer smaller government, but what are we paying? 35% taxes? We get absolutely nothing. Absolutely nothing.
Right.
So I'm not sure what's worse.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. But please return to kind of the outlay and a little bit more about where this all came from and where it's at. Like what's going on?
Yeah, so I just want, excuse me, to go through a couple of things that show us this trend of like, where did the IRS come from? Where is the Bureau created? Right? They say it's part of the Department of Treasury, right? But if you look in the statutes, the code that relates to the Department of Treasury, which is, like I mentioned, 31 United States Code, it's called Title 31. The IRS is like barely mentioned in there. It's mentioned here and there a couple places, but it doesn't say. And here's the thing: when the laws want to say something directly, it says it directly, right? Like if the IRS was an agency under the Department of Treasury, you would have something in Title 31 that would say the IRS is an agency under the Department of Treasury. Pretty simple, right?
Exactly.
It's not there. It's not there. Why? Why isn't it there? If it's legit, why isn't it there?
Exactly. Thank you.
And then also, like, for example, here's a specific example. In Title 31, U.S. Code 301, it authorizes the president to appoint a chief counsel for the IRS. But it also doesn't say it's part of the Treasury. It just says we can appoint a counsel. Like you could say we can appoint a counsel because it's part of it's an agency under this organization or whatever. It doesn't say that. It just says we're going to appoint a counsel, which is also kind of weird because most U.S. agencies, their counsel is the Department of Justice, right? That's the counsel for U.S. agencies. The fact that Title 31 is now appointing a separate counsel for the IRS is a little puzzling because why aren't they represented by the DOJ like everybody else if they're an agency of the government, right?
That's a great question. Great question.
So these are the things that I, have looked at, and these other people that I mentioned, they've looked at a lot of these same things and came to the same conclusion. What's going on here? There's a problem. Why isn't it clear where this organization is coming from and who has authority over it? Kind of weird, right? So you go, it gets even weirder because, first of all, the IRS is domiciled in Puerto Rico, which most agencies of the U.S. are domiciled within the U.S., not in a territory. Right.
Right.
And there's a whole history about it being created and the commissioner being put in Puerto Rico back in the beginning, and the fruit of the poisonous tree goes through all of that. It's very convoluted and confusing, but the whole thing started in Puerto Rico and it's still in Puerto Rico. And so it's not domiciled within the U.S.
For offshore?
Yeah, kind of offshore. I don't know what's going on with that, but that's another kind of thing that's a little bit weird. What else do we have? Oh, we also have the incorporation of the IRS in Delaware in 1933. So you can go on the Delaware Secretary of State website right now and look up Internal Revenue and Tax Audit Service, and there it is, created as a corporation in 1933 in Delaware. Now, is that still the corporation that they're working under? I'm not sure. But the fact that it was created as a corporation at its inception is a problem because U.S. agencies aren't created as corporations. They're created by an organic act of Congress. So why do we have a corporation being created for the IRS in 1933 if it's a U.S. agency?
And outside of the commissioner, do we know who else is involved? Like, is it becoming apparent that there's maybe outside forces? I heard rumor that there were possibly even foreign, like the Federal Reserve that I read came possibly from foreign interests as well as banking interests as well as like, do we see anything else like that in your research? Like,
Well,
or is it simply just an organic act of Congress for a commissioner?
well, here's the thing. This goes back to what we talked about in the beginning, because all of the money that's paid in taxes, it doesn't go to the U.S. Treasury Department. It goes to the Federal Reserve.
Okay. And
Now, the Federal Reserve is what? A private corporation owned by who? International bankers. So, I mean, I don't know. You follow the money.
right. Wow. Yeah. So, and I mean, and that's where we're up against right now, as we said earlier, the USAID money going offshore over to all these other countries. And some of it might make sense because we're helping, with real aid, but we're finding a lot of it that doesn't. And it's our tax dollars. And like we as the people should decide, like, do we want to, finance transgender education in another country? Is that our job to be doing that and sending our tax dollars over there? Which is an interesting thought, because, if it's our money. And when let's come back here to home, to America. We have real issues here in America right now. Fentanyl overdoses are off the charts. We've got people dying left and right. We've got, a host of issues that need addressing right here, right now. We've got people who can't afford their rent. Like, they're not making enough money. Businesses are closing down everywhere. So why is our tax dollars that we don't even know if this is a legit organization, we're paying into something, and then our money's going to places that doesn't look like it's serving us, the people?
Well, I mean, first of all, I think it's been pretty well established since like 1984 that none of our tax dollars benefit us. I mean, it's interesting, like what DOGE is doing right now is the very same thing that the Grace Commission did back in 1984 under Reagan. I mean, I don't know if you remember that, but the term drain the swamp, that came from Reagan in response to the Grace Commission report in 1984 that did exactly the same thing that DOGE is doing right now and found the exact same thing, $484 billion of waste and fraud and corruption.
He almost took a bullet.
Well, yes. And so he said, we need to drain the swamp in a famous speech. That's where that comes from. And they found the exact same thing back then that they're finding now, that our tax dollars are not going to help any American. They're going to these overseas offshore endeavors that have nothing to do with us, and they're paying for interest on the debt, and they're going to fraud, waste, and corruption. Nothing's coming to us. And a lot of people don't realize that, everything that you need for your life is not paid for by federal taxes. Schools, police, firemen, your roads, electricity, your infrastructure.
Well, that's all state tax.
That's all state and local taxes.
Sales tax.
Yes.
Yeah.
Not one penny of your federal tax goes to give you any of that stuff. So the, a lot of people say, oh, well, if you didn't get taxed, how would we survive? It wouldn't barely make a difference. Right? So it's crazy. And so what DOGE is doing right now is the exact same thing that was found out back in the 80s. And guess what? Congress didn't do anything back then either.
So what do you think? Where does that leave us right now? What do you think is like, I think knowledge is power. We're sitting here chatting about this, and we need to get more people basically aware of this because clearly our labor is not serving us. Like, we're working awfully hard. And
that's right. And I want to say really quickly about USAID. Let's not forget that USAID stands for United States International Agency of Development. Agency of International Development. AID, right? It's not aid. It's not humanitarian. It's about overthrowing governments and developing places internationally that benefit us. So it's not about humanitarian aid. And none of these, that's the name of the organization. So why are we even doing this stuff about transgender, whatever? It has nothing to do with international development. Second of all, if we are however many $1 trillion in debt, why are we paying 1 penny for anything that's not benefiting us? We don't have the money. It's being borrowed. We're borrowing money to go give it to like whoever. Who in their right mind would do that?
Right.
When we don't, but we don't have enough money to pay for the people who got destroyed in wildfires and disasters because FEMA ran out of money.
Yeah, I know. That was just...
I mean, what is going on here?
Right. The Helene hurricane was just shocking to think that these people are getting $750.
And FEMA said we ran out of money, yet they're sending $59 million to luxury hotels in New York for immigrants. I mean, this thing, it's just crazy. It's just absolutely lunatic.
So you're in the legal world, you're like coming down with this. I mean, it takes a lot of courage to be able to look at this straight out, like all of us, because it's not an easy thing, because it's a bureaucracy. We've been under this bureaucracy, and it's a big one. It's not a small entity. It's one thing to know it, but you said, unfortunately, Congress didn't do anything about it back then during the Reagan. Do you think there's any difference today? Is there anything we can do to shift any of this?
I mean, knowledge is power, obviously.
Yeah.
And I think that what we're facing right now is really a war of information, and it has been, I think, for the last 20 years. And, I find it very interesting because with the advent of the internet, I think that's really where the powers that be have been trying to put the control system in, right? Because you can't really have the control without the web, right? But I think that this last 20 years has been this kind of precipitous time for this control system, because they get the web in place, but then that connected all of us. Mm-hmm. And now we are all using the web to create our own networks and to get our own information out and to gather information for ourselves. And people have gone leaps and bounds, myself included, because of this access that we've had to this information over the last 20 years. And so, the more we're connected, the more we can learn from each other, and the more we can share, but also the more they can clamp down and control, right? So I feel like we're right at that point where that's kind of coming to a head.
Let me ask you a legal question about employment, and you may or may not have this answer, but I'm going to ask you it. So you're going in for a job, you're going to get hired, and you're going to agree through your paperwork to have them take your taxes out, okay? Now, could you go and basically sit with your employer and say, listen, I'm happy to take this job. I think I'd be overly qualified for it and really do a great job, but I'm not comfortable. I'm not comfortable with you taking these taxes out. I'd like to either work as an independent contractor, or I would like just to have those tax dollars directed to me, and then I will take care of my taxes. I mean, could we go in that direction if enough people were educated and we could begin to halt this process?
Well, the IRS has made that very hard for a number of reasons. Number one, the whole question of whether you're an independent contractor or not is very big in the law. And I don't know if you remember, there was some legislation about that having to do with the Uber drivers a couple years ago here in California. And it's a huge deal how you're classified. And you can't just agree that someone's an independent contractor if they're not. It doesn't work like that. It's not going to hold up. And the other thing that's happened is that the system has created points of liability to force people into the system. And so employers are defined as withholding agents, quote unquote, under the IRS. And what that means is that they're liable to pay the tax for their employees, right? So if they don't take the tax from their employees, they're the ones that are responsible. They're liable now for it as a withholding agent.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So they put the screws in various areas, so it makes it very hard to do that kind of thing. Yeah.
Interesting. So how do we see our way out of this? What do we do?
I mean, I don't know. This is one of the reasons why I have been trying to help people learn how to live in the private, similar to the way that the Amish live, right? Where they have their own agreements, their own rules, their own, insular society, and you can do that in our system if you know how to do it. And I think that that's one way to avoid all of this kind of thing. But it's not easy to do that.
Yeah, I mean, because if this, we're under the idea that we are giving our money to a federal governmental agency when we're not. We're not. And
well, that's right. And actually, I wanted to touch on, I know we've been going for a while, but I did want to touch on this one more thing about who is supposed to pay taxes under the tax rules that we have right now, because it's very confusing, actually.
a lot of this is confusing.
Yeah.
I think they like it that way.
Of course. And so one thing that's interesting is if you look in the tax code and you look at the definitions, like they say that anybody who is a United States citizen is liable to pay taxes, for example, right? But then you go and you look at the definitions. And if you look at the definition of United States, you know what the definition of the United States under the tax code is? You're going to laugh when you hear this. So the tax code is Title 26. It's like I was talking about. The way that the U.S. code works, it has a number, and then it says USC, which stands for U.S. code, and then there's another number, and that's like the section number. So the first number is the title number, and then the last one's the second number. So Title 26, so it's 26 USC 7701. That defines stuff for the purposes of the tax code, right? And even in the way that they introduce this section is weird, because they say, here's what they say in there. When used in this title, were not otherwise distinctly expressed or manifestly incompatible with the intent thereof, these definitions are used.
I'm sorry. That like went right over my head.
Exactly. It has a bunch of conditions in there. Normally, when you look in codes and it has definitions, it says the following terms have the following meanings. Something very simple.
Right.
Everywhere you look in the tax code, you've got this language that's just like, what in the hell is this? Like that, right? And then, okay, so here, I'll read it again. This is introducing definitions. When used in this title, where not otherwise distinctly expressed or manifestly incompatible with the intent thereof, these words have the following meanings. United States. The term United States means, when used in the geographical sense, includes only the states and the District of Columbia. Okay, first of all, why do they have a condition in there? And by the way, they don't have a definition when it's not used in a geographical sense. Okay, so...
It didn't even say 50 states.
Correct.
It said states.
Correct. Why? And then, okay, well, hold on. States is also defined. All right, let's go check that one out. The term state shall be construed to include the District of Columbia, where such construction is necessary to carry out the provisions of this title. Okay, hold on a second.
But it's not a state, it's a district.
Right, and it doesn't, the term state, it doesn't say, it said it shall include that. It doesn't say it shall include the 50 states.
Interesting.
Right?
Well, yeah, I'd heard this. Okay, other people have addressed this that I've listened to in different podcasts. And it kind of gets flipped because, in my understanding, the only people that actually should pay taxes are those in the District of Columbia.
That's what I'm getting at. When you look at these definitions and the way that it's done in here, and you also have to remember, there's case law that talks about this. When the tax code says a definition, you have to use the definition, even if it's different than any other definition you've ever heard. Also, when the tax code says something, you can't expand its meaning by changing the meaning of the definition that they gave you. Okay, so using those rules and looking at these definitions, sounds like you only have to pay taxes if you live in the District of Columbia.
I love this. Let's end right here. Done. Everyone who's listening, just note to self.
Yeah, this isn't legal advice, but go check the tax code for yourself and see what you think.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's, I always heard that in the tax code it says it's voluntary, which was really interesting.
It doesn't say it's voluntary, but it has this kind of, sleight of hand with the language that makes it sound like you have to do it, but when you really look at it, maybe you don't.
Right.
But even looking at it, it's not clear whether you do or not.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Yeah. It's I've been a taxpayer my whole life. I've been a part of the system, and it's a hard wake up, I have to say, to like look at all this and be like, wow,
No, it's really crazy. And I just want to point out one more thing that I think really drives this point home. And that's that in Title 26, 26 USC 4612, they also define the United States for the purposes of crude oil taxing. And guess what it says there? The term the United States means the 50 states, the District of Columbia, the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico, any possession of the United States, the Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands, and the Trust Territory of the Pacific Islands.
Wow, such clarity.
So clear in the part where we're taxing gas, but not clear when we're talking about who has to pay federal income tax.
Right.
So.
Right. Wow, this has been enlightening for sure. Thank you. I mean, I'm kind of like, I kind of knew a little bit of this, but you've just taken it to a whole nother level, which I don't know if it makes me more angry or it's like, we'll all have to sit with this. But I think, we need to know this information. If we're in a republic and we have free will, we need to look at our decisions and what we're doing and how we're going to do things going forward. And, it's nice when we commune together in like minds, like understanding the same thing to support each other. No one should go it alone in these waters. But this is what we do conversations about, sharing information, getting it out to more people, having more people have these conversations, and really look, because, we pay taxes. We discussed that. We all pay taxes, and we're not going to stop paying those taxes, property tax, sales tax, our own state tax. And I think each one of us is happy to do that. We want our school systems good. We want our roads to work for us. We want all that to be available.
Yeah.
But this one is like, when we're not benefiting, it's a tough one. It's a real tough one. And
when it's going towards things that may be morally incompatible with you. I mean, I don't want to be going and bombing people, or
exactly.
And am I paying for that?
Yeah. I mean, I know, Ukraine's super controversial, and when we have people overdosing on fentanyl, and we have people dying right here on the front lines, and we're sending money over there. That just really just breaks my heart, honestly. Like, I don't even get angry as much as I just get, destroyed at a heart level going, where is the humanity here,
Well, and if we don't have enough money to pay our own bills, why are we lending other people money?
Exactly. It's a good place to start to wrap it up. And I want to thank you for showing up. And, it's nice to hear it from someone with a legal background rather than just another person who's written a book because they've done some research. I mean, it takes a lot of courage to look at it from your perspective. So I want to appreciate that too. I feel it's more credible sitting here, understanding it from your perspective rather than just a researcher per se. And we don't have the answer yet, as we don't have the answer to a lot right now. But there's some eye-opening kernels of information you laid down for us. And we're all going to have to look. We're all going to have to take a deep look. And we're going to have further conversations with our communities, with our families, with our friends, and take possibly some action here down the road. What that is, we don't know yet. But what are your final words for everybody?
Yeah, I mean, my final words are, you got to open your eyes, and you've got to do the work, because freedom isn't free, and we've really, a lot of us, myself included, have, sat back on our laurels and thought that it was all going to work itself out, and we're starting to realize that it's not, and we have to be engaged, and we have to do the work, including understanding things like, do we have to pay taxes, and is the IRS even legit? I mean, I don't know the answer, but looking into it, I'm skeptical.
Yeah. I got reminded of, I told you about my great aunt, Elizabeth Leatherhead.
Yeah.
That is a funny name. You know what I realized? She is buried in Harvard's yard. Now, she's the only woman. Have you ever been to Harvard's yard?
No.
Okay. It's literally like the size of 2 driveways. I mean, whenever you hear about Harvard yard, you think of all these old military soldiers that were buried there. Mm-hmm. There's not that many buried there. It's very small.
Oh, wow.
And it's beautiful. If you ever go to Boston, you can see it. But she is buried there. She's the only woman buried there.
That's interesting.
And yeah, that was like huge for me. I wish my family is not that interested in our history. I was like the only person that paged through this book, but I also have a direct connection to Nathan Hale. Do you remember him?
No.
Well, he was the one who, if I had one life, I would give for my country, and they hung him.
Oh.
Yes, and so
Wow.
yeah, so I do have. That's why this is important to me. I'm really tied historically to, this idea of maybe us restoring a republic someday, maybe. And I think it's being discussed a lot in our present government to maybe have that restoration. We'll see. It's a big deal to, let go of a lot of this bureaucracy that we've been under for so long. So it will not be an easy unraveling, but maybe an important one for us to really thrive again, to bring back businesses, bring back family life, bring back, the culture that we all grew up with, and that these young kids have this opportunity to see that,
Yeah.
to see that and to be able to participate in it and do it in a truthful way, a way where they really understand how the government can serve them. We want a government that serves us,
Right.
and that's key, and we need to trust it, and we're having trust issues. All right, let's leave it there.
Big trust issues.
Yes. Thank you so much for being here. And thank you, everyone, for listening. Please stick around. I'm going to head into a nice meditation because that was a very heady conversation. So we need to ground, get in our bodies, and begin to trust again. See you soon. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you. This has been an interview with Jessica Barsotti. If you like this podcast, please like and subscribe for future podcasts.
Hey, this is Jessica Barsotti, and if you want to learn more about what I do or connect with me, you can reach me at barsottirose.com.
Let's come together for meditation. So today we're going to be working with purifying the body through breath. So we're going to be working with breath of fire. So what is breath of fire? It's drawing a deep breath in, and then with the mouth closed, pushing the exhale out the nose quickly and repetitively. A good way to do this is put your left hand on your solar plexus. That's below your sternum bone, above your belly button. Take a nice breath in, and then push out through the nose repeatedly. It sounds like this. You will feel your solar plexus go in and out. You'll know you're doing the breath correctly. Excellent. So let's come and sit. Let's ground our sit bones, drop our shoulders, feel our spine and our heart slightly elevated. When ready, please draw breath in slowly. Fill the belly, fill the chest, roll your shoulders back. And just let that breath out. Either blow it out softly or let it out the back of the throat through the nose, feeling your body ground or relax. Slowly breathe in, mouth closed, pull breath in, expand from the inside. Go all the way out to the end of that inhale. And then again, transition to an exhale. And if you haven't dropped your gaze or closed your eyes, please do so. Feel your body melting and softening inward. Good, let's do one more nice big breath. Draw a breath in. Feel the belly, feel the chest, but take the breath up into the space between the brain and skull. And imagine that as you exhale, you soften the brain away from the skull, release any pressure around the forehead, around the eyes, the eye sockets, the jaw. So now you can feel yourself slowly coming into a neutral body with a neutral mind. This is a great place to begin to purify the body. So again, bring that left hand to your solar plexus. We're going to slowly breathe in with the mouth closed. We'll do breath of fire for a little bit. Then we will exhale out the breath for a count of 5. We'll hold a suspended breath for a count of 5. And then we'll take a deep breath in again and begin our breath of fire. So with that, slowly draw breath in, mouth closed. Breath of fire. Begin pushing out through the nose. Shoulders relax, keep it up. Please take a nice inhale, draw a breath in. Drop your chin slightly and hold the breath in for a count of 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Lift your chin, release the breath out the back of the throat through the nose for a count of 5. 1, 2, 3, 4. Suspend the breath for a count of 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Now take a nice inhale. Breath of fire. Keep the shoulders relaxed. Feel the solar go in and out. Take a nice inhale. Drop your chin, hold the breath in for a count of 5. Lift the chin, slowly let the breath out the back of the throat through the nose. Feel your body releasing, letting go for a count of 5. And then suspend. Don't inhale or exhale, just suspend. 2, 3, 4, and breathe in. And breath of fire. Take a nice inhale. Drop your chin slightly and hold the breath. Lift the chin, slowly release the breath. Mouth closed. Suspend the breath. When ready, draw a breath in. And release that breath again and just ground. Let your shoulders drop, let your sit bones settle, let your hands just release to your knees. And just sit quietly for just a little bit, just feeling the different energies moving through the body, cleansing and purifying. Take your hands to your heart. In prayer mudra, take a breath in. Sit Nam, Namaste. Thank you for joining me.